And we're glad to see everyone. I'm Judith Rodin. I'm president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Lively morning. We heard from Jane that we live in the digital age. We heard how developing countries are opening up their governments and using evidence-based research, and how that's becoming more precise, and how the physical world is becoming digitized through the makers movement. One of the conference tracks that followed really took up such an extraordinary and compelling issue, modern-day slavery. I'd like to introduce another of our important tracks, and that is Feeding the Next 7 Billion, that introduces the conference track on agriculture and nutrition. And while we really must think about feeding the next 7 billion, let's remember that the demographic prediction is that by 2050, the population will hit 9 billion people, all needing to be fed, and most of them wanting to be far better fed than they are today. A majority of the 7 billion and nearly all of the incremental 2 billion will be living in Africa and Asia, the two regions of the world that are home already to the 900 million people who are still hungry and undernourished. So it follows that despite the great success of the first Green Revolution, the challenges of feeding a growing population, particularly in Asia and Africa, are far from over. How we will provide for all of these people with a nutritious diet and ensure a source of income for the many who will rely on farming remains one of the very great challenges of the 21st century, and one that our participants will shed some light on today. Some of you know that we're celebrating our centennial at Rockefeller, and we've given a good deal of thought to the issues of the pressing needs and issues of the 20th century. And these issues, many of them, remain a driving force for our second century, and agriculture, of course, is one of those pervasive issues. In July, we'll host one of our centennial events in Abuja, Nigeria, to focus on exploring opportunities for innovation in agricultural markets, and particularly new forms of financing. If you think about what we need to worry about as we think about the future of our food supply, there are at least three issues. First, the fact that in order to meet the 2030 food, feed, and fuel demand, we will require somewhere between 175 and 220 million hectares of additional cropland. That's not even considering the additional inputs that will be required, such as more secure water and better nutrients. A second factor is that as incomes rise around the world, we'll see a shift to diets that consume more calories, more fats, and more animal products, all of which require more inputs from land and water and energy. For example, every pound of meat we produce leads to a cow consuming 8 pounds of grain. So we really are talking about unbelievable pressure from all sources of food as the population grows. And a third factor, and a really consequential one, is climate change, which is already having devastating consequences on agricultural productivity, particularly in developing countries. This coalescence of factors will require new action from philanthropy, as well as from governments and private enterprise, to innovate ways to increase production and nutrition, while cutting the inputs that lead to environmental degradation and contribute further to climate change. We have got to begin now investing in solutions that cut waste all along the value chain, increase the resilience of smallholder producers and their crops and their livestock through finance and insurance products, for example, and provide cross-sectoral interventions that ultimately shift the way we consume, the way we produce, and the way we think about food in this century. The solutions will look quite different, whether you're talking about developing countries or developed countries. But there are clear linkages, for example, ensuring that the innovations in seed and water and soil fertility and other technologies are able to benefit farmers all over the world. Many of us believe that we are at a tipping point and that what we do in the next few years will be absolutely crucial if we are to ensure that 9 billion people, when their time comes, will be fed and fed well. I am delighted to be joined by 3 energizing, engaging leaders, each of whom is planning and working and collaborating with so many other sectors and actors to address the challenges and to identify solutions to what many see, even currently, as a global food crisis. Jane Karuku in the middle is the president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. Prior to joining AGRA, she was at Telecom Kenya, where she was the deputy chief executive and secretary general. During her tenure, she's credited with the transformation of that organization and the creation of a truly new Telecom Kenya. She worked with Cadbury before that as managing director in East and Central Africa, responsible for its operations in 14 countries across Africa. Carter Roberts, to my left, is the president and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund. Prior to joining WWF, he led international and science programs at the Nature Conservancy. With inspiration from nature and a background in business, Carter has sought to solve problems by creatively influencing the way markets and businesses operate. He has also tracked some of the rarest creatures to the far ends of the world and has worked with communities and heads of state in North America, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Carter has written both academic papers and informal blogs for numerous publications ranging from Fast Company to Conservation Letters. And furthest for me is Trevor Tompkins, the founder of Venture Dairy, which is an innovative for-profit investment company that works with nonprofit partners, putting their resources to work to provide appropriate technology and training to transform dairy enterprises in emerging economies, and also to create impacts that extend throughout the enterprise chain all the way to the smallholder farms. During his 12-year tenure as CEO, Trevor oversaw the growth of the company to becoming one of the major players in the U.S. dairy industry. So now let's begin. A general question for anyone who wants to take this first. And this one is about Africa. It was only a few decades ago that most countries in Africa were completely food self-sufficient. Many were exporters of agricultural products, and that remained an important source of income for both smallholders and larger companies, and certainly a source of growth for the countries. What happened? Why is it now that most of Africa has become a food-deficient region that today spends tens of billions of dollars to import food? What do African countries and their partners need to do to get things back on track? Maybe we'll keep talking about the later one as we go through the panel, but at least let's ask what happened. Jane?
Yeah, thank you, Judith. I think several things happened, and I think as I watched some of it, I think I've seen some of it happening, is that we changed our eating habits. When we changed our eating habits, we started eating things, first of all, we do not grow. So things that were not very well adapted. That eventually led us to start growing things we wanted to start eating. And which had climatic conditions then were not good for those products. And then on top of that, global warming, changing climatic conditions happened. So it's like double tragedy as you went on. Then we have another arm, which is more to do with the government policies and how enabling they were to make sure that markets were sustainable, so the farming for either the smallholder farmer could be profitable, therefore, as a business, and give everybody energy and hope to keep going on. And then there's a population increase. When do you want me to stop? And then there's a population increase. Mm-hmm. That the population increase outstripped the production. So then you find yourselves in the combinations of all the other things that I've mentioned, it got us deeper and deeper into the process. Then other things happened like SAPs that forced government maybe not to concentrate in terms of their investment in agriculture changed. And instead of being very socialistic, it became very private sector driven, and that brought the competitive ability of the farmers to question and therefore not sustainable. Maybe I stop there.
Sometimes I hear also the World Bank blamed or funder policies which directed what kinds of crops and what kinds of agricultural, at least, produce. I don't know about livestock. There's so many funders in this room, although not multilateral agencies. Do we think that funders do push and did push in this situation in directions that ultimately had negative consequences?
Yes, I think sometimes funders do push because they have their own conditions and they have their own objectives they want to achieve. So if those objectives are not really aligned to the population or to the priorities of a government, you could find yourself in such a quagmire that you come with good intent, I'm giving you money, but because it was not a very well thought out process, and neither was it collaborative enough with other actors, then it doesn't get the end result it should have gotten. And I think that's a big challenge. Certainly, I think there's a lot of movement now, and people are getting more conscious that we have to sit together and agree what's the best way to sort out these issues. But I think previously there was a point where it was more like top-down approach, do this way, or not get whatever I'm bringing to the table, which I think is disastrous.
Other thoughts about Africa and why it turned?
I think, I won't comment on the funder impact, but there are some estimates that since the 1960s, Africa annually has lost about 1% of soil fertility every year. And that has huge systemic impacts on the productivity of agriculture. Turning that around is going to require an intensive effort to rehabilitate lands. And I think there's some promising programs that can get after that. But it's going to take a multi-decade effort to make that happen. But when you look at, I think Africa right now imports $50 billion worth of food. And when you look at the vulnerability to the changes in the prices of commodities, and particularly with climate change on top of that, what we saw with the Arab Spring, you can imagine that occurring in many other countries as well.
Yep. Any thoughts on this one, Trevor?
Well, maybe a little controversial at the outset, but U.S. Farm Bill policy has not helped in terms of undermining some of the market opportunities and the incentives to grow. But I also see that many aid programs have unfortunately not delivered the sustainability that they should. We've had, I believe, much too much of a push approach at production level and not a pull approach, so there haven't been the opportunities really for markets to function and pull products, and there's incentives for producers, farmers, to really grow their businesses.
If the last time we saw this really export productivity, a lot of that export was not to other countries on the continent, but to Europe, and the view that the developed world were better markets, they were willing to pay higher prices. Do you think with the new, not so new anymore, but with the growing capacity of the regional organizations within Africa, that the trade this time, if there is export, will be within the continent, and that that's another tool towards increasing productivity and the output markets operating more efficiently, or don't you see a role for them?
I think there's a lot of change within the regional countries bordering each other. What has hurt the intra-regional trade has been, again, government policy and a lot of political interference. So we've seen examples where countries are just starting to get enough to eat and enough to export, but then somebody somewhere just comes and puts an export ban. But I think we, as the regional politicians, are starting to understand this, that for you to sustain this productivity and to sustain the income of these farmers, you have to allow them to sell to export markets, and not necessarily export markets outside Africa, but just within, because there's enough market even within Africa.
Let me move to a second question, and that is the interface here, sort of what the track is about, between agriculture or livestock farming and nutrition. Often we're talking about feeding calories without talking about nutritional interventions. Is there a move afoot to link them more effectively? And if so, how do we actually do that? There's a resistance, for example, to genetic modification of seeds, particularly in European countries, that is one mechanism for nutritional fortification. How do we address this question?
We're going to have to address the question, and I, as one voice in the environmental movement, it's clear that we're going to have to become more nuanced about our approach to breeding. You're right that there are parts of Europe that see GMO as an unacceptable option. But there are modern day approaches to plant breeding using new technologies that's not the same as GMO, but certainly you can select for traits that address both productivity and nutrition at the same time. And I think that's, we're going to have to make that happen. And the environmental movement is going to have to become more sophisticated about how it looks at those choices.
Trevor, how about in the livestock and dairy industry?
Well, we've got a long way to go. So part of the problem is that we've got very low productivity in the dairy industry. Really across the developing world, we've got cows that are capable of producing 12 to 14, 15 liters of milk a day that are producing on average 2 liters of milk a day. And the reason they're producing such low volumes of milk is that they're not being fed balanced diets. And it would be so easy to balance diets using modern analytical technology. And in doing that, we would be able to change the feed efficiency of these animals from, say, less than 1 kilogram of milk now per kilogram of feed to 1.5 to 1.6 kilograms of milk per kilogram of feed. So just think about that, it's huge. And sort of tie that into the nutrient density of milk and the opportunity to really improve diets. In Africa, we've still got terrible problems with stunting in children that could be so easily prevented by highly nutrient-dense diets such as milk. And with fortification added to that, it's very, very low cost to add essential vitamins, minerals, and trace elements to something like milk. I mean, really, less than cents, US cents per day can make huge changes. We've got to be adopting these things and trying to develop these much more productive systems. And the impact on global climate change is going to be significant too, because we all know that cows are methane producers, and methane's a greenhouse gas. So anything that we can do to improve the efficiency of these animals is fundamental, in my opinion. So.
Let me slice this by sectors. Again, philanthropists in the room. So to address more effective linking of food security and nutrition, what's the role of the various sectors? What should philanthropy be doing in its special role? What's the role of government in doing this? And the private sector? How do we think about each of these sectors in playing a role to make sure that we're not feeding people empty calories, or we're not degrading the environment in order to increase the nutritional value, or reducing people's health in one way by trying to get more calories into them in another? How do each of these sectors play a role?
I think there's no denying the central importance of the private sector, and particularly the biggest companies on earth that buy and sell these commodities. And what we've seen is a growing sensitivity on the part of those companies. We're talking about companies like Unilever, Walmart, Procter & Gamble, Coke, Mars, to not just buying commodities on the basis of their appearance or their performance, but also on the basis of how they were grown. Did they require deforestation? What about labor laws where they were grown? And looking at those factors as well. And so we're beginning to see those companies begin to send market signals that they will only buy those commodities if they've met certain standards. And our dream, of course, is that we're able to tip the market where the whole markets in those commodities are based on not just the performance of the crop, but also all the other externalities that go into growing them.
Government?
Well, let me just say one last thing. From an environmental point of view, the worst impacts are not from those leading companies and producers. It's from the ones that either that don't care about those voluntary agreements, and there's no denying the role of government. And that at some point, government is going to need to set a regulatory framework that builds in those externalities. And our hope is that the more of these companies that make these kind of commitments, the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a set of the biggest companies on earth, in Davos 2 years ago made a commitment that they would remove deforestation from their supply chains. Very exciting, but we need those companies to pull government into preventing the very bad actors from creating the greatest amount of damage.
Yeah, I think government work is around policy for enabling, let's say, such good private companies to keep working in the sustainability of what the farmers produce themselves, either for nutrition or for income. And also for stopping the bad guys, because I think if you're an outsider and you're just a private company, you probably don't have a lot of force to self-control, but you need government to support you in that. So there's a very big role for government. For philanthropists, I think their role could be to break the cycle. The reason we do have a problem, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is because input markets are very expensive. I mean, inputs are very expensive. So fertilizer, new seed, or even the whole area around agronomy, there's a very big gap between what their current is and what there should be. So philanthropies can break that cycle, because all you need to do is, within a certain group of smallholder farmers, is break the cycle. So they can either get the seed, then they produce better, they sell to a good private company, they make money, and it goes around that. So I think the role of philanthropy is to break that cycle.
Yeah, and I think there are some areas where we're stuck.
Yeah.
We're stuck in terms of the transition that you're talking about.
Okay.
And that requires additional capital in just the right place. And I think you're right about philanthropy and the role that it can play.
I think once you break the current cycle and everybody's pulling their part, because if I'm a smallholder farmer and I get money to continue to plan for the next season and to buy the things that I need to buy to sustain myself, I need the private sector to ensure market sustainability. Then that becomes self-sustaining in its own. But if one of those places doesn't exist, there's no private sector where I can take my produce, the policy was not enabling, then I'll get into the cycle of every time, please help, please help, please help.
Trevor, you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Well, I agree with both what Carter and Jane have said, but I see these real disconnects in the value chains from the smallholder farmers to the markets. And we've got to do a much better job of connecting all these dots, whether it's cotton or cocoa. And dairy is maybe the worst because we've got a highly perishable product, which we've got to get from the cow to be cooled to some type of processing center so that we can add value to it and preserve that value and then get it to a market. And there's real disconnect. There is not a whole lot of sector depth or experience in, for example, the dairy industry in parts of these developing communities. And so I see also that we lack enterprise in these value chains. We've got to be empowering entrepreneurs to take responsibility for growing and expanding these value chains. And that's just not happening at the rate it should. And so I would really encourage philanthropy to be looking at ways in which it can really encourage this entrepreneurial spirit and provide the wherewithal in terms of entrepreneurs having access to capital and then appropriate technology.
Great. Let me get more specific about the work that each of you does. Jane, let me start with you. Rockefeller and the Gates Foundation are the proud parents of the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. You are the CEO. It will be terrific, I think, for this group just to explain what AGRA does, and importantly, what your view is of the value chain, how you support the smallholder farmer, and just the holistic approach to intervention that AGRA is taking.
Okay. Yeah, so AGRA, we work across the whole value chain. So starting from, we build capacities of scientists so they can do research on better varieties for the different crops that are within the certain ecological zones across 16 countries. We work with national institutions to do research, and then we work on agronomy, we work on distribution of new seed varieties, because adoption, availability, and affordability are the biggest challenges in terms of better varieties to smallholder farmers. So to this date, we have about 14,000 agro dealers, and their work is just to distribute from the private seed companies who we try and encourage to the smallholder farmer wherever they are. We then work on market access, because we are starting to find very many good examples of where farmer groups have now got excess and they need market. And these farmers are not stupid, and they can smell the money. So if I produce X and I know I can sell for a lot of dollars, I'll keep doing that and invest a lot of my time and even borrowed money. And then we work on policies within government advocating within government institutions. In my own opinion, if 60% of policies in sub-Saharan Africa were enabling to farmers and private sector, I think would resolve the issues on food security, because it's a big problem. Across that, we work with farmer groups, because a single farmer who probably has 2 acres of land is voiceless. So the only way you can make them have a voice to advocate to their own governments or to negotiate with private sector banks to get money is when they're in a group. So we do build skills of these farmers as farmer groups, and they can be either financial literacy, how to borrow from a bank, how to go about having warehouse receipts, how to manage post-harvest losses, and a lot of those good things. We then also work on financial accessibility. One of the challenges is that to break the cycle, we need to give these farmers financial access. So we do work with private sector banks and other impact funds to get instruments on helping them where they can borrow. And by the way, the repayment is very good for smallholder farmers. The examples we've had, most of them we've had 0% repayment back. I know I saw James of Equity Bank in Kenya. We had a project with them, and there was 0 default. Me and you could default, but the small little people don't default.
So Jane, an instructional question, I think, for all of us who are funders. Yeah. What happens when you're on the ground and there's a lot of investment in a country in that whole value chain that you just described, yeah, and then there's some huge government disruption? Either the government gets overturned, there's a coup or unrest, or conflict suddenly breaks out. How does the work on the ground proceed? What are the challenges?
I think the challenge is if you were not very in-depth in terms of empowering farmers to continue, whoever is at the top, then you fail. Because these are the group of farmers, whether there's a new government or not, who continue putting pressure on their own government. And then if you were good enough to have imparted the skills, be they agronomy, be they, maybe it's a local private sector seed company that is supplying them seeds, it's okay. Where it goes bad is when the policy change will go away with the old government and you get a new government with new policies. That's a real risk. But hopefully that when you get a war, that the policies are not thrown out the window, but the policy is the biggest challenge in that regard.
Carter, let me turn to you. The World Wildlife Fund is pretty extraordinary in its history of protecting species and its conservation approach. But more recently, you really have gotten into, I think, with both feet, agricultural development and all of these issues. Maybe you can tell us why, what you've learned in this integration in your journey, and how you're starting to see agricultural development as part of the solution rather than part of the problem you're addressing.
Yeah, I think you can look at the numbers globally, which are about a third of the world is used for agriculture right now. 12% is devoted to parks. And then there's about 25%, which is either desert or roads or cities. And that leaves about 30%. What's going to happen to the remaining 30%? Right now, we're converting land from natural state to agriculture at about 0.6% a year. So at that trajectory, that 30% will be all devoted to cropland within 50 years. And so when we look at those numbers, it's clear that we could either decide our role is to document the demise of nature, or to work proactively with farmers and fishing communities and ranchers to come up with more productive practices. And so you're right, we've doubled down on this. And all you have to do is go to the edge of the Amazon, which is constantly moving. And what you see is ranches where trees have been felled to create beef production, or soy plantations. You go to Borneo, and you can almost see the palm oil moving on a daily basis as it creeps into the heart of Borneo. And the good news is when we look at the range of productivity for any particular commodity, the best producers produce 100 times what the least productive ones produce. And so there's hope. So we have essentially created a team, a global team that works on this. We've identified the 15 commodities that have the greatest impact on the natural world, ranging from beef to palm oil to cotton, sugar, and soy. And for each one of those, we've identified the companies that trade, sell, buy the most of that commodity. And there are 100 of those. And we now have MOUs with 56 of those companies that commit them to a trajectory towards sustainability. And we're working on getting the other 44 on board. And there are huge opportunities that we see. One is that Consumer Goods Forum group that I talked about earlier. The other one is we're working with the World Bank right now on an initiative to potentially restore and rehabilitate 250 million hectares of land throughout the world, which would have a triple benefit. It would reduce pressure on forests with the additional greenhouse gas benefits. It would provide jobs and income to farmers, we estimate 25 million. And it would help us meet this new need for food production in the world without altering the natural world at the same time. So those are the kind of things that, to me, give me a lot of hope. It means that we're hiring very different kinds of people. We have much more people from the private sector, people who've spent their lives in the food economy. And I would say the greatest challenge is for us, at the end of the day, it means helping smallholders and local producers make that transition. You can't just send a signal from the top. And so we're working with the Dutch government on a transition fund right now. But it's a really exciting time. It's the fastest growing part of our work. And the role of philanthropy right now is, I think, helping us invent these new solutions all the way through the supply chain. I was talking to someone last night about BRAC and how BRAC is taking this system-wide approach to new sectors. And that's what we're trying to do here. And there are areas where we're stuck, and we need either long-term contracts, a pool of capital to make bigger purchasing decisions, or funds to help us continue to innovate or help smallholders in specific countries make this transition. Because at the end of the day, we've got to help everybody make this transition.
You know, you mentioned BRAC. BRAC had to do it all. So they had to be every sector at once. There was weak governance, no real private sector, so they became everything. I think the model that you're describing is really validating the role of each of these individual sectors, expecting them to be strong, and figuring out a way to leverage the capacity of each of them to really have some kind of catalytic effect. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about that. Trevor, tell us about your organization and your approach, why dairy farming plays such a key role in this whole ecosystem, and how you organize to get the leverage that you do.
So first of all, the dairy cow, or buffalo, and is a ruminant animal. So it's unique in terms of its ability to digest non-human food products. So that's a big plus in favor of dairy. And for everybody that's been in the developing world, you will see that cattle are everywhere. They're really the backbone of rural economies in the developing world. But most of the farmers, unfortunately, are not connected to markets. So 80% of all the milk that's produced in the developing world is basically going through some kind of middlemen into informal markets. It's not getting to formal markets. So there's really very little pull. So the thesis that we wanted to test and went out 2 years ago to test and started in Nicaragua was that if you have an anchor processing firm that is linked to the market and is doing a good job selling the products into the market, creating a market, putting them in appropriate size packages for the position on the economic strata where you're aiming those products. Once you've got that anchor processing firm, you can start to do really transformational upstream work to smallholder farmers. Because now the smallholder farmers have got access to a formal market. And once they've got access to a formal market, they're no longer dependent on a middleman who might come and pick up their milk today, but might not because it's the rainy season. I've already got plenty of milk. But now you've got a formal way of capturing the value of the milk through the anchor processing firm. That firm can then provide credit to the farmer against future deliveries of milk. You can put a dairy hub, and this was a model that was really pioneered by Tetra Pak, Tetra Laval in Bangladesh, and it's an extraordinary model. You put a dairy hub, you provide the farmer with access to proper feedstuffs, to artificial insemination, to record keeping. But the but is that farmers only learn from farmers. The world over, farmers are very skeptical people. They don't learn from people turning up, telling them how to farm. And unfortunately, that has been part of the problem, as I see it, all across the developing world. We turn up and tell people what they've got to do, and it doesn't work. What we've got to do is show them what to do, and then they really believe, and they believe most from their neighbors. And so what we're doing in Nicaragua is we've got an anchor processing firm. And just as sort of an aside, a processing plant to process 100,000 liters of milk a day is only a $7 to $10 million investment. And I say only because it's a very small investment in terms of how it really powers back to the farmers. And so once you've got that processing processor set up, and you go back and you take appropriate technology back to the smallholder farmer, you show him and you get his milk yields literally from 2 liters a day to 14 to 20 liters a day if you do it properly. And that's transformational, and people see it and believe it, and they do it. But it requires somebody who understands how to balance a ration and how to pregnancy test a cow. So that means you've got to have somebody that's really prepared to put his arm or her arm inside a cow to palpate it. And those are things that, unfortunately, those skills are still not common in much of the developing world, which is a travesty.
You commented now and in your prior comments about credit and entrepreneurship and the like. And we often hear for the smallholder, whether it's livestock or crops, that credit is a rate limiting factor in scaling beyond subsistence productivity. We know that banks are starting to come in. I think Equity Bank, James Wang is here or coming. And so we've seen their very good work in Kenya. But again, for philanthropy, how can philanthropy play a role in assuring that there is credit available for these small and medium-sized enterprises, whether it's seed companies or collectives of smallholder farmers or the like, to go to scale? Often we are criticized of our grant funding preventing the incentives for private capital to come in, disincenting that kind of activity. So can you help us think about that?
I would like to think that ultimately philanthropy will really move to impact investing. And impact investing, as I see it, is the sort of triple bottom line where we're looking at people, planet, and profit. And those are all, they've got to come together. So we've got to develop sustainable systems. And capital, I think, is this critically important component of really strengthening these value chains. And I think that unfortunately there has been a mentality that profit is bad, but profit is essential if these value chains are really going to work, and profit's got to be generated, all along the value chain. For too long, there's been I think many people's minds kind of a harvest mentality amongst processors, not only dairy processors. They really haven't worked back upstream to the smallholder farmers, but we've got to have these value chains that are really properly connected. And I think that philanthropists, as they look at how they can make the biggest impact, should really think about the impact investment concepts.
Jane?
Yeah, I think I support him in that. I think impact funds will really go a long way, because even these smallholder farmers, however poor we think they are, they actually don't want it for free. They actually keep saying, come and invest with me, and now pay back. And I think the example you've just mentioned in Kenya was a very good example, where AGRA and IFAD got together with the government of Kenya and worked with the private sector bank to de-risk, put some de-risking instruments within the bank, up to $50 million leveraged. And the amount of farmers who borrowed were very many, and they were from banana farmers to maize producers, maybe even to some dairy. And they paid back, and they were not borrowing a lot. On average, it was about 300,000 shillings, so divide by 100, $300 to $500 borrowing, not actually a lot. And their lives have really been changed. And the default rates, they're the ones I was talking about, was 0, but they paid back. And the agreement was just reduce the interest rate to about 8 to 10 percentage basis points better than the commercial lending rate. And farmers really went out for it. And as a result, because our model has worked, is now being scaled up. And another role of government, Judith, is for them to invest, because in sub-Saharan Africa, government is the single biggest spender of money. So in Kenya, the government has decided to keep investing, and I think they put in their budget for the next 10 years, each year $20 million to just leverage more money 10 times within the other banks, and I think that would go a long way. Other countries like Nigeria have taken that and taken it to a bigger scale. They're talking of $500 million. So Tanzania, the same. Ghana are about to go to do that. So it's a very good model for breaking the cycle, where your funds are actually going to be paid, and it's not a handout. It's actually a contract. You change your life, give me a bit for helping you change your life, and let the relationship keep going. So that's very good.
Carter, thoughts on this?
Yeah, when I think about the role of philanthropy, it is obvious to all of us on this panel why there's hope for the future in terms of productivity, the ability to rehabilitate lands, reduce waste, which we'll talk about eventually, I think, and all these other things that we've discussed. There are places where we're stuck, either in convening all these players and bringing them in a room together and identifying areas for transition where either longer-term contracts, which would guarantee farmers the benefit. If growing a tree, it takes 15 years to get the full benefit back from that. Well, if you could pioneer a new scheme where you could guarantee the farmer the greenhouse gas benefits and compensate the farmer for that, then they're more inclined to plant that tree and take the time if they have more guarantees behind either the future benefits or income stream of taking that risk. There are other examples of pooled purchasing, but also I think in this field, taking the extraordinary examples in certain countries, certain producers, and disseminating those more broadly. That those are all opportunities, I think, for the world of philanthropy to harness the extraordinary capital in the private sector, which just needs to get together and move in this direction. And we're seeing, I think there's a huge opportunity here. It just takes some nudging along the way.
They're really important. You mentioned waste, and I do want to get to that because often we don't think about this in a holistic way. So globally, the estimate is that we waste 1 out of every 3 calories produced. It's true in the developed world where we throw away much of the food per capita as people in other parts of the world have to eat. Waste is different, but equally pervasive in developing countries, where up to 40% of the food harvested is lost before it's consumed, here due to inadequacies of storage or transport or processing or poor markets, as Jane talked about. So how do we think about both all the way from post-harvest or in fishing or livestock, which is post-catch or even, but that beginning of the utilization, all the way through to the developed world and the post-consumption waste, if we are going to really address feeding this growing planet. Want to jump on that first?
Sure. I think the way I look at it is, imagine that all the world's food production is in 9 silos. The first silo is lost due to post-harvest waste. The next 3 are converted to 1 silo of meat and dairy. And then 2 more silos are lost due to post-consumer waste. Either it ends up in our trash can at home because it doesn't look so good, or the expiration date has gone bad. And then a lot of it ends up in the dumpsters behind restaurants and supermarkets because of a lot of the same things. And so at the end of the day, you're left with a fraction of what you produce. You're left with 4 silos against the 9 that you've lost 4 silos rather against the 9 that you started off with. So on the ground, there are ways to address post-harvest waste. And one of the things that we dream of is a 1-ton container, locally repairable, that would enable farmers to store their crops, protect them from animals, insects, and water, and then enable them to keep those crops until the market prices are better. If someone can invent that, if someone can create a prize to invent that, a reasonable price container that could be used over and over and over again, that would be huge. But when you think about what we're doing here at home in the United States and other developed economies, getting the American public to think differently about expiration dates, to think differently about portion sizes, to think differently about bulk purchasing, requires a really creative outreach using social media, the likes of which we haven't done yet. And in my latest board meeting that we held just down the street at Google, we dreamed of using our brand and using our institution to engage the American public on these issues of the choices they make. Do we really have to have the perfectly gorgeous vegetable in order to eat it? You know, do we It's a food that we throw out because the expiration date is past, really not good anymore. And finding ways for people in this country to think explicitly about the choices they make is enormously important. I think a huge opportunity. And the same thing, if we can think of some devices to urge them along the way, I think that's a huge opportunity for all of us.
Jane?
Yeah, I think if I took the same analogy of silos, my silos would be more upstream. I think the first one would be invest in breeding for varieties that would stay longer, because within sub-Saharan Africa, okay, the fridge would not be there all the time, so the expiry date question might be a bit off. And then, so what are the breeds that stay longer? And then how do we, I like your idea of storage, so we could take the silo of storage, but there is a key one, which is innovation on value addition, because it's not going to be value addition on large scale industrial, it's innovation on little value addition kit, like to thrash, if you, for example, corn or maize, you've harvested maize, how do you store it? How do you shell it? Is the right word shell? Yeah, how do you shell it and store it better until you sell it or until you can consume it in the next 8 months? And then how do you store other perishables like vegetables before you consume? So it's more on innovation, on little technology that can help a farmer preserve the immediate needs before they go to marketplace. So those would be my two silos.
And I would add that there's this critical need to really educate that nutrition and health are ultimately one of the same. That if you get nutrition right, you really get health right. And we've got it so far out of whack, unfortunately, here in the developed world, where one can go out and slam 3,000 calories at a fast food joint in 5 minutes before your body even tells you that it's sated. When 1,200 or 1,500 calories would be more than enough for probably all your day's requirements. So we've got this tremendous waste at this level, and in the developing world, products just not getting to market, and milk's a classic example of that, because it's highly perishable, and by the time it frequently gets to the collection center, it's already pretty far fermented as a result of the heat and the temperature, and
So a new question. We're in the land of Sheryl Sandberg, so I have to ask you about women. The smallholder farmer in Africa is a woman, and many, I guess, in other parts of the world as well. And yet, certainly in many of these communities, we still see extraordinary gender inequality, despite the fact that they are often the producers. How are you approaching, if at all, these issues of gender and gender-related issues around the work that you're doing?
I mean, the biggest problem is where there is cash and the women do the hard work, and frequently have all the knowledge about how the animals should be taken care of. But as products go to market, cash goes to the husband or the man, and the problem is that the woman just doesn't get it. So as we get digital technologies changing this, that we can give credit on some type of mobile device, and that credit can be turned into goods at the local store. I think we can make big changes on these fronts. It's a huge problem. In Rajasthan just recently, exactly that sort of situation. A woman with 3 beautiful buffalo, we asked if she would sell any surplus milk, and she said, no, I don't want cash coming into the household, because then I get beaten up after my husband gets back from the bar.
So mobile cash kind of technologies may be one solution. What are some others, Jane?
Yeah, I think one is education. I think the more the women are educated, I think the more they'll be aware of their rights And I think the more they will be respected. I think another one is we are starting to invest now on what we call women crops, because men tend to own the cattle, and they tend to own the cash crops and maybe the big staples. But with vegetables, those are known as women crops. I think they'll have higher value, and it will also help in terms of the nutrition aspects of the family once we get that. So it will be sort of a good solution to both nutrition and income for women. But I think education overall is what is going to help, so they can be better at advocating for their rights, better pay for the work that they do.
Carter?
At the heart of our work on a local basis is ensuring communities have the rights to their natural resources and to manage them. And at the heart of that work is ensuring that there's a stronger role for women within those communities. And I've learned a lot through a partnership that we have with CARE, where we recognizing that really our future work is about a future in which both people and nature flourish, that we ought to build partnerships with institutions that aren't like us. And so Helene Gale and I got together with Ginger Saul, who served on both of our boards, and envisioned a partnership where we started in Nepal and Mozambique that is grounded in the role of women in these local economies, managing natural resources, and addressing many of the issues that Jane just mentioned through that partnership. And I love this partnership because we're learning a lot about a completely different worldview. We're learning a lot from each other, but I think at the end of the day, for these communities, the real promise is when they manage their resources for themselves, and we give them the tools so they can do that better.
None of you mentioned land tenure and property rights.
Yes, so I think...
Can we talk about that?
Yeah. So I think a big one is policy. And this is again for government. Government has to do this because women do not, in most cultures, don't own land as such. So if they don't own land, then they don't have any right to property or any right to collateral to progress to the next steps.
Trevor, you want to go?
No, I slightly differently, but for example, in Nicaragua, the women are being given free membership of the cooperatives, so that they are given a kind of leg up, if you like, in terms of their initial ownership of. So it's making a big difference.
I talked earlier about this Degraded Lands Initiative, and it is a no-brainer. If you go to Borneo, there's this rainforest in the heart of the island, and then it is a sea of palm oil around the rest. And the future palm oil that's being produced, instead of going to land that's lying fallow, not being used, the producers are cutting down more trees because the land tenure on the degraded land is uncertain. And so when we've talked to the World Bank and others about this initiative, you need good science to figure out what are the most potentially productive areas for food production on land that's degraded. You need finance in order to encourage and incentivize future purchasers from the market to go to that land first instead of to land that's being deforested. But it's the tenure piece that's the complicated piece. And so we're imagining the creation of new companies that have community ownership in those degraded lands so that they share in the future benefits, but you need to work with the government to sort that out. And that is one of the trickiest, but also one of the most important things that we need to move on, which is working with governments like Indonesia to ensure that local communities have either clear title or clear benefits to that land and can play a role in its resuscitation and the benefits that come from that.
Well, we tried to put together a panel that would do two things, that would show you the complexity of these issues, but the multiple approaches to really taking an important, enormous set of steps to address them. And I think that our panelists have done both. Fantastic work. Please join me in thanking them.